It's nice to sometimes sit in a cafe or restaurant or wherever and look at everyone else talking and eating, functioning, and I have the thought that maybe this is all a dream and we're in the dream, watching everyone in the restaurant eating and talking. I like that sense. So if we talk a little bit about what is meant by life as a dream. And maybe what that can help elaborate on what certain words that we hear so much about in spiritual seeking and spiritual literature: awareness, consciousness, manifestation, unmanifest, experience. No person, everything's a happening, no doer. Within the context of understanding the dream, the night dream, we may actually start to realize that actually the components in the waking state are not necessarily that different from a dream. Especially when we stop looking at the dream only from outside, from the perspective of the person that has woken up in the morning, then it's very easy to look at the dream from that perspective. But at the same time, if we insert ourselves into the experience of experiencing the dream from within the dream, which is basically the night dream experience when we're not awake. So the experience of being the character, which doesn't seem like a character when we're having a dream, it seems like a person, me. Then a lot of what is pointed at in spirituality can start to be referenced back to the dream experience that we've all had. We've all had the experience of dreams, what we're calling night dreams, but maybe they're not as sort of separate as it appears. The way that a night dream is, and then the way it is when we wake up. There's a big contrast in content between this and the night dream. Contrast in such a way that this experience is designed to be continuous and for it to appear to be real. This is the reality. And then when the night dream just collapses, it's finished, and we wake up to what we call reality, then the assumption is, well, that was just a dream in my head. Maybe it was an experience arising in the same space that this experience arises in. And it's just designed for the dream experience to be experienced like this, and then afterwards another experience comes in that creates the impression that the dream experience is very different from this. That the dream experience happened in my head. We can start to see, if we investigate it, that is made to appear like that. And that if the content of the dream was much more similar to the content of the experience that's there when we wake up in the morning, we wouldn't actually be able to differentiate which was dream and which was waking up. So what if, let's say that you're having a dream, you're in bed, having a dream that you're sitting in bed, and the bed that you're sitting in your dream is the same bed that you know as the bed you went to sleep in at night. So remember, this is the dream you're having, that you're sitting in bed, listening to a conversation outside your bedroom window that two men are apparently having. So you can hear in the dream the voice of two men. And the two men are gardeners, and they're talking about what plants they're going to plant. There's a project going on, and the project is a landscape project of the garden that is of the complex that your flat is in. So the dream that you're having is that you're sitting in your bed listening to two gardeners talk about the plants that they're going to plant and where they're going to plant them. And there's the sound of a bird chirping, and the gardeners are just about to start talking about the specific plants, the names of the plants. And in that instant, you start up in bed and wake up. And you find yourself sitting in the same position that you were sitting in your dream, in the same bed, in the same room. And in that instant, you hear voices outside the window of two men that are talking about plants being planted. And now they're describing the name of the plants being planted. If the dream and the waking state are such that there is an absolute continuation between the two, there'd be no distinction between what part was happening in the dream and what part was actually now what we consider the waking state. And so I'm not suggesting that the dream was happening because you could hear these men outside your bedroom window. The dream is an experience that's filling a consciousness, and the dream is a dream of you sitting in this bed, in your bed. So if that was the case, then the assumption in the waking state would be, I wasn't asleep. I was just listening to the whole conversation. There would be no frame of reference that says the first part was a night dream, and then the bit where they actually started describing the flowers they're going to plant was the waking state. What actually happens in life is that the dream that we have is so radically different in content to when we wake up. We wake up and the room is here. We have a dream, and the dream is about whatever, being on holiday in some remote location. And so it creates this contrast that makes us think of a dream as something happening in the head of the sleeper. But if the dream was of your bedroom, and then you wake up without realizing you're waking up, you just sit up in bed and the conversation carries on from what was in the dream. There'd be no practical difference between dream and the waking state. Can you just pass the microphone back, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but a dream, there isn't any consequences from a dream. I can dream I'm doing something. Now, if I got up now and attacked you, the people in here's perception of me would radically change, each one, and there'd be a consequence to that action. I can dream it, nothing happens.
But within the dream, there could be consequence, couldn't there?
But they wouldn't manifest into reality, into my reality. It'd still only be a dream. It wouldn't alter. Okay, if I had a dream, they can't see my dream. If I get up now and do something, they become part of the dream. It actually manifests into a reality. I know it's my reality, but it becomes their reality as well.
But in the dream, let's say there's a whole room full of people, and you came in the dream and attacked me.
Hypothetically, I could come and give you £1 million, whatever, whatever it happens
Sounds
to be.
better.
It doesn't be attacked necessarily.
So in the dream, the people will maybe all rush up and try and stop whatever's happening. And in this experience, they might do the same. Or everyone in the dream might be afraid and run out the door. And in this experience, everyone be afraid and run out the door. So what I think you're implying is that, well, in the dream, all the characters are just characters.
My manifestation. I'm manifesting them. Mm-hmm. They don't exist. Like these people all think they exist. Mm-hmm. But in a dream, they don't exist. They don't exist. Yeah. They only exist in my mind. Yeah. But these people perceive they exist. And they've all got their own way of their perceptual way of seeing this moment.
Are you sure?
No.
No. But you are sure that you exist? As in, you are familiar, you are, in this moment, you are familiar with the consciousness functioning there.
Yes.
Yeah. But I'm just an object in your consciousness.
But I could come and touch you.
As could the character in the dream, right? Go and touch another character.
Yeah, but it works. But if I'm a singular item and I come and touch you and no one else can see you, that's a dream. But everyone else can see you, so it's a big dream. Because you could walk outside and walk down the street and the people will see you. So we're all in a massive dream. Everybody's in the dream. Mm-hmm. And it's a fantastically complex dream that everyone's perception is the same dream.
If we assume a lot of things, so we're assuming that people can see me. So this is an exploration into the nature of experience, what we're doing. So it's going to sound a little sci-fi-ish, but the point is to sort of come to see that life may not be exactly as it seems. So we have a lot of beliefs and assumptions about life that on investigation may not be as valid as we think. So we have to question a lot of things when we're doing this exploration. One of those things is, do you know that these people have more perceptive capacity than the characters in the dream?
No.
No. So this is not to say, we now say that they don't, but we can't say they do. We're starting to be a little, get real a little bit with this experience. So in a night dream, the night dream spontaneously arises out of nowhere, out of nothing. Actually, I'm deviating from your comment. I was going to carry on about the nature of dreams and reality. So even the belief that I manifest the dream is something I would ask us to question. Do we know that a dream arises in your brain? That's the assumption we have, right? Because the experience tells us that the night dream arose inside Roger's brain. Maybe not. Maybe that assumption comes into place only after the dream is finished, and this experience comes in that makes it appear like that was a dream inside the body of the dreamer. So let's look at. We'll put the. It's a good question because it now gets us to check our assumptions about a whole lot of things. So if you just turn it off while we're not speaking. If we start looking at the nature of a night dream, we'll see that before the dream exploded into existence, there was deep sleep, let's say, or another dream. So the other dream finishes, it collapses, and then let's say there's nothing. Nothing means no experience. No experience of the waking state, no experience of dream. And in an instant, a dream manifests. Manifests mean comes into existence. Wasn't there 1 minute, there the next. And so now let's start looking at what this manifestation is. So for a while we'll just assume that there is a dreamer, someone in a bed, and that the dream manifests inside their mind. So we'll look at it as though there's an individual mind. And so what is a dream? It's an arising in mind, a creation in mind. And when we look at the nature of mind, we can maybe conclude that consciousness is the nature of mind. So there needs to be awareness of the dream. And the word awareness and consciousness we can interchange. To be conscious of the dream, to be aware of the dream. So the dream arises in the mind, and we can say that the mind is consciousness or the mind is awareness. So the dream is an arising in consciousness. And the dream spontaneously arises, wasn't there before, and then spontaneously there it is. And what arises is a story. A dream is usually a story. And in most dreams, it's a story of time and space. It's a story of objects. So pretty much a story of daily life. And in that story, there is the impression of a future and the impression of a past. So the main character, who just came into existence with the dream, has a memory of getting married 5 years earlier, has a memory of having kids that are now 4 and 5 years old. And when we look at it, the dream wasn't there a moment before and spontaneously appeared. And the character is convinced that he has a past, is convinced that he's been married and has kids, whereas actually he just came into existence. There was nothing before. But the content of the dream puts in place memory that implies, from the experience of the character in the dream, implies that there's a past. And the experience of the main character, which is where the dream is experienced from, the experience is that I am real. The experience is not that I am in a dream. The experience is I am real, and this is an objective reality. So let's say the dream was taking place on a beach. Out of nothing, a whole world, the whole beach landscape came into existence. The sea and the sand. And the main character is on the beach, and the experience is of feeling the sun rays on the body and feeling nice, and maybe walking up to the water's edge and the water is lapping up on the sand. And as soon as the toe touches the water, then there's a sensation of water touching what I am, touching the body. And so we can see that a dream is perfectly designed, perfectly constructed to create the impression of separation and the impression of objectivity and reality. And so in the dream, if the person were to clap their hands, the sound happens at exactly the time that the hands touch.
Understand, to take it to the simplistic of being on a beach. If you dream you're laying on a beach in the sun, you won't wake up with a suntan. Mm-hmm. It won't happen because it's an illusion of the mind. Right, if you're actually laying on a beach and you've not got factor 20 on, you're going to burn. You know, that's a fact.
Yeah, yeah.
Within the reality of everyone in this room.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they'll all burn. None of them will be immune to that. It doesn't matter if you lay there and think it's not going to happen, it will still happen. But that's the reality within the confines of our reality. Whether that's reality or it isn't, it's, you know, this room, it was built and it exists. Mm-hmm. So if it fell down, there'd be some people who would be hurt. But in a dream, I could dream it fell down and no one would be hurt. Because it's not... I know what you're saying. It's a paradox, isn't it? But it's difficult for me to get my head around.
Yeah, so we're doing an exploration, so it's good to have questions. In the dream, the character could fall asleep on the beach and wake up with a terrible suntan or terrible sunburn in the dream.
In the dream? Yeah.
So if his wife suddenly came along and gave him a big hug, he might feel this, you know, tenderness of his back, for example, because he's fallen asleep for 2 hours in the sun and got really burnt.
But his wife wouldn't she wouldn't be a part of that perception. It'd be a perceptual idea in his head. If this guy here, if I caught fire and he poured a bucket of water over my head, I'd be grateful. But if he just said I'd burn to death, you know, because if I dream it, it's only my perception. You see what I'm trying to say? There's a group perception. Yep. That's different to a singular perception of your reality. You've got a perception of reality, which is a singular perception. I'm in a dream. I'm I'm Napoleon or something. People think, well, he's nuts, you know, and then you end up in a nut house. You know, it's a difficult one.
Yeah. So the.
You understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah. So in the dream, if someone caught fire, a character in the dream can pour water over that person who caught fire, and the character will be as grateful to the character in the dream that poured water over them, as you would be in this experience if you caught fire and someone poured water over you. So I can understand that maybe what I'm saying sounds like there's a big difference, but the exploration into this is to see what the difference is. If it's
I don't necessarily agree, but I see where you're coming from. But I think it's a bit metaphysical. I don't think it really works in the real world, because there's a cause and effect. It's like you said earlier, if the judge, you go and say to the judge, well, I don't exist, he'll say, well, you know, I don't exist, but you've got 10 years. And then you'll have to face that 10 years. And how you go into that is up to you, but it's not going to be good.
Saying that in a dream world, you would face the same consequences in that dream world.
Yeah, but you don't.
No, I know, but the dream character might.
Yeah, but then, you know, if I'm in a dream now, you're part of my dream. So and you're part of my dream. So if I come up and take your handbag and take all your money, you're not going to worry about it. It's only a dream. It'll give you all my money now. You know, it's all a dream.
If I was dreaming, I would feel the same way.
But
can I don't know, because I've never spoken before, but an experience I had sort of like,
yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to do it now. About 5 years ago, I was laying in bed and, can you hear me? Oh, that's better.
Yeah, it's good.
I just laying in bed and just sort of, I was awake, but I hadn't come, I was just seeing. just seeing everything around me, but I didn't realise I was just seeing, apart from the fact in front of me was a digital clock. And it just went tick. And all of a sudden, I realised that time, the clock, my body, my daughter came in the room, her body, was all outside of me, or inside of me. And I was the consciousness looking at it. And it just went. The first thing my mind came back in and said, oh my God, if that's what they're talking about, that's like death. It was like my head came in. And I just let it go. But it's always played in my mind. And I often go back into that, so I can go be in this room, and I can just shift into that space where everybody's in me. And time, the time is in that. Does that make any sense? No. So in a way, to me, that is the same consciousness as the dream. No. Have I made any? Oh. That's all.
Yeah.
I don't know why I said that, but it was something you were saying. I could see that there was the consciousness of having a dream is the same consciousness I'm having now. So I could...
Like a visualisation.
Like
a secret sort of thing. You see it and you manifest it.
No, I didn't manifest it. You can do it now. You can sort of... If you've seen it and you change perception, it takes a bit of... You can be the space and everything can be in your space. The time, you, me, everybody can be in your space. But it's because I saw it like that. Because I saw it by accident. And because the digit on the clock, I thought, oh my God, there's no time. That clock's in me. And it just, if I hadn't seen the digit on the clock go, I wouldn't have noticed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're all one thing, in effect.
Well,
separate.
The thing is, it went away, but it never left my head. And I keep going back to it. It never left my head. So I had to keep going back to it. And it's all grown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really go to Satsangs, but I've been listening to your talks. And they sort of, stop my left brain and my right brain getting confused. And there's even more open space. Because like, can I stop now?
Yeah, you can stop.
I don't know if I made any sense.
Yeah, what you describe as an awakening, what you describe as an awakening to the nature of life as an experience.
Yeah.
So we can start off by saying life is a dream, because it then allows us to compare between the waking state and the dream state. But if we keep using the word dream, it can make it seem like it's not, reality. It can diminish life to something dreamlike.
This body as well. It's not separate from anybody's body.
Yeah.
It's all one.
Yeah. So that this is the awakening to the nature of experience. That experience is that life is an experience, and in an awakening experience, a lot of things are demonstrated, like the fact that there is no subject and object, that the whole experience is one singular experience arising in a single consciousness, and that what I am as a physical body is just an object within that arising in consciousness. And it becomes very clear that a night dream is the same thing, an arising in the same consciousness. And when the night dream is present, the arising in the consciousness is experienced exactly as the content of the night dream dictates. Yeah? So the purpose here is to explore a night dream, or have pointers towards the nature of a night dream that maybe allow us to look at this experience and see this experience as more like what's described by the mystics, what's described by spiritual teachings and wisdom texts, and maybe understand what is meant when the wisdom teachings say life is a dream, life is an illusion, life is not what it seems, you are not the doer, everything is a happening according to God's will, life is a creation, the world came into existence in 7 days is a metaphor for saying, well, actually cause and effect doesn't apply to the creation in terms of how it is created. So 7 days, it's not really 7 days, and maybe it was an instant. But it's what it's saying is the world didn't necessarily come into existence over billions of years, which is, on the one hand, the dream is designed to create the impression that life came into existence as a gradual thing over billions of years. And so, we're getting hints as to how to look at life radically differently from what we experience it. So in this exploration, the point is not to take our experience of life as given, but to compare the dream state and the waking state, and maybe adjust what we consider to be reality, and see maybe it's closer to a dream than we might think.
Has consciousness always existed?
Consciousness has always existed, but not necessarily in movement. So consciousness at rest is what turns into consciousness in movement. And consciousness in movement is what I would call the manifest, or the dream at night. It's all consciousness in movement. And consciousness at movement, when it's not in movement, we could call consciousness at rest. So consciousness always exists, but in a different state, we could say. One we can call the manifest, consciousness in movement. The other is the unmanifest, consciousness at rest. But all there is consciousness. But we also have to be careful how we define the word consciousness. Because consciousness at rest is, in this definition, absolute nothing, not even awareness present, the absence of even awareness, the absence of the sense of existence, complete, absolute nothing. And I would call that consciousness, so I would say that consciousness in one form or another exists all the time. So shall we carry on looking at a dream? So within the dream which spontaneously arises, there's a story, a timeline, and there's a main character. The main character we call the protagonist, and life is being perceived from the perspective of that main character. And in the course of the dream, the character may go for a walk down the beach, bump into a friend. Oh, hi Fred, how are you? Have a conversation with Fred. Fred speaks back. And all along, the experience from the point of view of the character is that he's the person, he's the talker. Fred is another person. And Fred is responding, but all according to our own free will. When the dream collapses, which it can do at any point, the ocean and the sand and the main character and his friend Fred and everyone else on the beach collapses with the experience. They didn't really exist. They existed as an appearance, momentary, in the mind of the dreamer, or in consciousness, if we say mind is consciousness. And from one moment to the next, there is manifestation, no manifestation. And in the next instant, another dream can spring into existence out of nothing. And This dream might be a dream of being in a city with cars and roads and shops and people rushing around, horns and maybe a bird and all sorts of things. And in the same fashion, the main character in the dream is walking down the street and someone comes and snatches his bag and runs off and he runs after them. And maybe they get into a fight and there's all the physical sensations and consequences of that. And from the perspective of the main character, this is reality. And in an instant, it can collapse. And so looking in at a dream, we can see that what is experienced as completely real may actually be an experience in consciousness that experiences whatever the content is, however it's designed to be experienced. And so this might get us to question, because we know from our own experience that a dream can feel absolutely real. A dream is experienced as if time and space is absolutely real. A dream is experienced as if the character has complete free will. It's experienced as if the character is not one with everything in the experience. And in hindsight, looking in after, with our understanding of what a dream is from our own experience, we see, wow, the character was one with the experience. The character was thinking and moving and walking and talking exactly as it was destined to do according to the creation of the dream. The character was part of a predetermined story. The character didn't have absolute independent free will to move around in the dream however they wanted. The character couldn't jump out of the dream and have an independent existence outside of the dream. The character came into existence with the dream. The character moved because he was part of the dream. And when the dream collapsed, the character collapses with the dream. The consciousness in which both dreams arise, the dream of the beach or the dream of the city, is the same consciousness. The character is the character in each dream. Let's say they're different ages. Roger aged 20 and Roger aged 40. And the consciousness functioning through the character in each dream was the same consciousness, the consciousness of the mind in which the dream arose. So from one perspective, we can say that the dream arose in consciousness. And from another perspective, we can say that consciousness linked to a particular body-mind within the dream, using it as a vehicle through which the consciousness functioned and through which the dream was experienced. So, looking into a dream, we can understand these sort of seemingly opposites, that everything arises within the consciousness, and also recognize that it's the same consciousness in which everything arises that seems to link to a particular body-mind and function through that body-mind in the dream and experience the dream from that perspective. And so if someone in the dream came up to the main character and said, hey, do you know this is a dream? That character would appear because they're part of the dream. The question, do you realize this is a dream, would be part of the dream. The main character will respond exactly as they are destined to respond according to the construct of the dream. The main character would say, what are you talking about? This is a dream. This is reality. And the character that's, no, actually, if you think about it, what you think is your doing may not actually be your doing. What do you mean? They can have a conversation. And the conversation, if it happens in the dream, is the conversation that's destined to happen. It doesn't change the fact that the main character will still feel as though they're a separate independent entity with free will. But on reflection, we find that the main character is doing exactly what they are destined to do according to the makeup of the dream. So if life is, as the mystics have been pointing out, life is a dream, life is an arising in consciousness, and whatever happens in each moment is a happening and not your doing. If that's the case, then it makes sense that if it's a dream, that what happens in each moment is happening according to the storyline of the dream. That the character is not the doer, the other is not the doer, that the pleasure and pain that happens within the dream is not an attack on the essence of the character. The pleasure and pain that happens in the dream, essentially when the dream ends, the mind of the dreamer remains intact, remains unaffected by what happened to the character. And if in the dream the character dies, then the dream collapses, and what has really died? The character in the dream never really existed other than a character in the dream. And the consciousness in which the dream arose doesn't die when the character in the dream dies. So how does that help? Does it help? Is there any point in questioning whether life is as real as it seems? The point of mentioning it here is because when we come back to what we're really looking for, we might all agree, actually, I'm just looking for happiness. All of my seeking, all of my efforts in life, I engage in because I believe that this might make me happy. And that seeking for happiness is an intuitive thing. It's a result of our true nature being what it is and understanding that the true nature is at its core happiness. And so questioning life can be relevant for this happiness. Because when we look at what our unhappiness is, we find our unhappiness is based on the belief in personal doership, based on the idea that what I am is essentially this physical entity, based on the idea that because I'm the physical entity, my completeness is dependent on pleasure and my completeness is attacked by pain. And so if we turn out to not be what we believe ourselves to be, if life turns out to be different to what it presents itself as on the surface, then it's worthwhile seeing this. And so the main points that are significant here is the doership aspect, meaning that if life is a creation, if life is an arising in consciousness, if life is a momentary experience, then it makes sense that what happens in each moment is not my doing, is not the other's doing. What happens in each moment is essentially, from the perspective of the individual, destined to happen. And so, however we come to see that we are not the agents of what happened, however we come to see it, if we see it, it means that the claiming ownership over everything, claiming ownership over what happens, holding the other as the agent of what happens through them, can fall away. And if that falls away, something very simple and significant happens, is that the foundation on which guilt, blame and pride arise gets eroded. Means no more carrying around a load of hatred for those people that have delivered pain to you in the past, and no more carrying around the load of shame that you might have for those actions that happened in the past that we deem as my actions that delivered pain to others. And no pride for actions that happen through me that deliver positive outcomes. And if we stop engaging in life from this perspective of doership and therefore question whether life actually needs to turn out a particular way in order for me to be complete, then there's the chance that we start coming in contact with the essence of the human being that has been covered up by all of these other beliefs. So if anyone has any doubts, I'm not really trying to convince anyone that life is a dream. What's most important is for us to acknowledge, is our uncomfortableness with life, is our unhappiness in life, does it manifest in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, and expectation that life turns out a certain way? If we can acknowledge, yes, these forms of thinking and feeling are what make me be able to say in a particular moment, in this moment I am not happy. So if we can come to that conclusion, and if we can come to the conclusion that maybe human happiness is just the end of human unhappiness, if we come to that conclusion, then given we can see that the basis of this unhappiness is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, then it would make sense for us to inquire, is it true that I'm the doer? Is it true that the other is the doer? And is it true that my completeness is dependent on pleasure, 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 pleasure? So it means that our spiritual search can become really focused. The fact is, as you said, life, dream or no dream, is going to have consequences. So this is not some way of eliminating consequence from life, but it is a way of starting to clearly categorize what's what. And as I mentioned this morning, the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. So whatever happens in each moment is either pleasure or pain. Consequences are either pleasure or pain, and our attitude upon investigation is where our happiness or unhappiness lies, not in the circumstance, but in our attitude to circumstance. And the attitude that delivers unhappiness is an attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome.
So how does what you were saying relate to what you were saying earlier about that thing called choice in the moment? do we, depending on the choice in the moment, jump predestined storylines?
So how the predetermined story of life unfolds is through the character making choices. So in a dream, it's a story of time, and the storyline, we can say, unfolds not because of the character, but because of the way the story is created. So a dream from beginning to end unfolds exactly as it's created. But in practice, the dream unfolds by the character making choices. So the character is walking on the beach, and at some point it comes to a junction and it decides whether to go left or right. And in practice, it feels like it is the character's choice, the person's choice. But in theory, that choice is part of the dream. So the dream includes all of the choices that ever get made. But given the dream already includes all of the choices, doesn't mean that choice doesn't exist. Choice is simply that moment in the dream where two options are presented and one is picked. But it's not picked, the choice is made through the individual, but it's not their choice.
But if a different one was picked, wouldn't the rest of the dream be different?
If a different one was picked, it would mean that it was destined for that to be picked, because the character has no independent free will. The character can't, of its own volition, make a choice. And so therefore, whatever choice is made in the dream is not the character's choice, but the choice that was destined to be made. And so really, when we look at it, the dream can only ever unfold one way. At each point, it appears like the character could choose one of two options, because two options are presented. But a character will only ever be able to choose the option that is included in the story. Just like a character in a novel. At some point, the character is presented with two doors. And in the novel, the thought arises, should I go in the red door or the blue door? And the novel will say, and the character stood there for several moments, unsure of which door to pick. And then the church bell rang. And in that instant, the character decided to go in the red door. And so the character opened the red door, and in he went. So we can see in practice, the story is a story that suggests the character is the chooser. But quite clearly, we can see that the choice was made as part of the story. So in the story, the character was always going to choose the door, the red door, at exactly the time that the church bell rang.
So this morning, when I was deciding whether to come today, I was never really not going to come today. There was never really a choice as such.
According to the concepts in this teaching, which are not just made-up concepts, they're concepts that stem from a particular way of seeing life, which is very different to how life can be seen alternatively. So the concepts in this teaching say exactly that everyone is here in this moment because it was destined for that to be the case. 13.8 million years ago, you could say, at the beginning of time. And any questions that are asked because they are part of the story, and there's no way that they can't be asked.
So if in the story I'm racked with indecision, I'm not really racked with indecision because the choice has already been made.
You're racked with indecision as part of the experience, but that indecision is not really your indecision, you as a separate independent entity. So if you were to then say, I'm sick of myself, I can never make a decision. That's guilt. That's seeing yourself as the doer who is failing to do properly. You're failing to make decisions. Now, that guilt is attitudinal, to what is happening. It's a certain attitude to the indecision. That attitude is also not your doing, also part of the story. So if you feel guilty, it's part of the story. And as you said, in practice, it feels like it's your indecision. But in the overall scheme of things, it can be seen to be the makeup of the content in the moment.
So if there's no doer, it's a false belief, and the thinking brain's associated with that. Or the thinking mind, whose mind is the working mind, and isn't that just as illusory as the thinking mind in the ultimate analysis?
Isn't it, what's the last part? Isn't
just as illusory as the thinking mind in the ultimate analysis?
Yes. So both the thinking mind and the working mind are sort of conceptual separations. Actually, we can more technically say the working brain and the thinking brain. So brain and mind, in this case, mind really means brain. And there aren't two brains. There's the one brain, and we're separating out the way that the brain functions into the thinking brain and the working brain. And there's no thinker, there's just a brain, and from the other, a brain functioning based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or if we want to look at it as a dream unfolding, then there isn't even really a brain. There's just thoughts arising, thoughts that we're now categorizing still, even though there's no brain, into the working brain and the thinking brain. And so there's no thinker of the thinking mind. There's just thinking happening as an output of the brain or as a spontaneous arising, whichever way you want to look at it. They're complementary ways, they're not opposites. And the working brain is exactly the same principle. It's a brain that is working based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, or as it's the thoughts arising as they're spontaneously designed to arise. The significance of separating them is just to show that certain types of thinking are suffering and uncomfortableness with oneself, and the uncomfortableness with oneself is based on certain ingrained beliefs that are put in there as part of the story. And those ingrained beliefs, if they're false beliefs about who we are, we're calling them the basis of the thinking mind. And the working mind is the same, except when the working mind functions according to the story, what it produces is not suffering. What it produces is contemplation or functional thinking.
So life keeps on exposing me to these sort of radical ways of thinking. And I'm just wondering, am I in the slow class? Because how much exposure does the working mind need? Or is the thinking mind just co-opting the message the whole time? And I mean, what's happening that you can hear these things over and over again and not experience it?
Could it be destiny? Which really means the predetermined story unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So could it be that this story says, I'm not going to expose someone to this concept once, and then in the storyline say, and so she was exposed to this concept once, and all her other deeply ingrained beliefs suddenly fell away instantaneously. Remember, this is a story of cause and effect. The story has been written to follow apparent rules of cause and effect. Now, the way that the deeply ingrained beliefs were put in place is through cause and effect, so through experience being fairly consistent moment after moment through our whole life, and as a result of the experience being consistent and presenting itself in a certain way, that I am the doer and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and a habit gets put in place to function that way. And so this circular sort of snowballing effect puts in place the deeply ingrained beliefs. So the story of life puts the deeply ingrained beliefs in place according to a process of cause and effect, apparent gradual process. And so it makes sense that it might undo the beliefs in a similar way. So what you're saying, what you might be feeling is not much change having happened, may actually be not as black and white as you think. So maybe the exposure to these concepts has been bringing about change, but not to the point where the old beliefs have been completely uprooted. But maybe much more significant change than is apparent. So it could be that the storyline now says, well, we've been exposing this young lady to these concepts for years, and it's about time that we bring about significant change. So at any point, significant change can happen. And so it will happen when the conditioning in life is delivered in such a way that a significant insight or click happens. So the insight or click could be when you're just going about your business tomorrow and something happens, and it's very obvious when you look at the mechanics of what has happened. This isn't my doing. And this is something, like, not just saying it, but you actually see the mechanics of the situation. Say, the outcome was very fortunate, let's say, but I see that I didn't make this happen. And if that's seen deeply, then that's when radical change happens. And can you tell me when that is going to happen?
No, probably never, it feels like.
In theory, when will it happen?
When I realise I'm not the doer.
But when will that be? In theory?
I don't know the answer.
When it's destined to happen.
Well, I think it's a stupid story, and I'm wondering why consciousness does this to itself. Why does consciousness put itself through pleasure and pain when it can just remain in equanimity and consciousness?
Why not?
Because it's stupid.
Yeah, well... but let's say it's done all the other things. It's experienced all the other stuff. So why not have a go at this? Given it's just an experience. But in order for it to be a really convincing experience, the divine hypnosis or the creation needs to be created in such a way that the illusion is a complete illusion, in order for the suffering to be experienced as if it's absolutely real, in order for the separation to be seen as absolutely real. And actually, it's not so stupid, especially when the rest of the story unfolds, when the remembering happens in the story, and the remembering is, let's say, the falling away of the suffering, and then it's all seen. That was all illusory. When I say illusory, I don't actually use the word very often because it's
a dirty word these days.
Is it? Yeah.
In non-duality.
Okay, so what I mean is that we can see it was all attitudinal, that my unhappiness, my suffering, was never actually because of the circumstance. I was never suffering because someone, stole money from me. I was never actually suffering because someone didn't perform in a relationship like we had agreed that they would perform. That was all circumstance. And my suffering was always attitudinal to circumstance based on what I believed that meant about me or to me. And so at that point, essentially we see, wow, that was all that suffering, well, it was there, but it wasn't as real as it appears. I mean, it was very real in terms of it felt terrible. But now the suffering no longer happens. The circumstance continues to happen. People will still let us down. People will still steal money from us. But now we find, oh, my happiness isn't affected by that. What's affected by that is the pleasure or pain in the moment. So no doubt if someone steals my travel wallet with my passport and all that, I'm fairly confident, very confident, absolutely confident, without using the word absolutely, that suffering won't arise. It will be a huge inconvenience. And inconvenience means pain in the moment. I might even get very angry in the moment. But the attitude that says, why did this happen? It just simply can't. It happened because it was destined to happen. It happened because it was my destiny to experience the pain of the inconvenience. It was their destiny to do the stealing of the travel wallet. Their destiny to get the money that was in the travel wallet. My destiny to lose it. And so the question why and a hatred for them doesn't exist. It can't exist. How can I hate a character in a story that is doing exactly what they're destined to do? How can I hate myself as when I see I'm a character in a story doing exactly what I'm destined to do? It's probably not as far away or as impossible as you think, because the fact that you're verbalizing your questions in fairly coherent ways, questions about a rather radical way of seeing life, and the fact that the decision to come, which was never really your decision, still means you were designed to feel a pull towards spending your Saturday here in this sort of environment. All of those are very good indications that the story of life is creating a conduciveness to a certain set of outcomes, because the story does follow apparent cause and effect.
But what if I die first? What happens then?
You would be dead. It means that it was destined for your death to come at that point in time prior to a significant realization, let's say, if that's what happens. And I can assure you at that point there'll be no one that will be worried about whether it happened or not, or whether you died or not.
So what is it that exists then?
An experience? An experience? It's a great question. So what exists is this experience. But I wouldn't just... So I don't like leaving it at that, because then we might just keep saying it's just an experience. It's really important, and sometimes to see it's an experience, it's best just to be told this is just an experience. This is it. Because it's hugely significant to be able to come to see that life is an experience. When life is seen as an experience, a whole lot of things are revealed. The nature of experience essentially is revealed. And what is always there with experience, never separate from experience, is awareness. And what we could say we are at our core is awareness. So to see life as an experience means to know ourself as awareness. When we don't see life as an experience, we don't know ourself as awareness, because the awareness aspect, which is so ephemeral and nondescript, goes overlooked. And so the opposite of life as an experience, the opposite is life is reality. So we might start to see that the dream at night is an experience. If there was a virtual reality that we engage in, put your virtual reality goggles on. That's an experience. That world is an experience. So you have an experience of that world. This experience is designed to be taken as a reality. So as soon as we say, this is real, we're not recognizing it as an experience. And the real, when we're investigating experience, we at some point we come to see that there can't be experience without awareness. That's the ever-present component of experience. Without awareness, there won't be experience, will there? When we take the world as reality, we say, well, it's real, and whether I experience it or not, it's there. So now awareness is not so important. So that's why the saying that says, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? It's pointing to, so our normal perspective of life as a reality, as an objective reality, says regardless of whether someone's there to hear it or not, and the someone represents awareness or consciousness. That's what, in that saying, if there's no one there to recognize it or to hear it, does it make a sound? So the someone represents awareness or consciousness. In our standard assessment of life as a reality, the answer is, of course it makes a sound. Because the tree thumps on the ground, there are two realities, and a sound is made. Whereas what it's pointing us to, it makes us think, what does that mean? If there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Hopefully, life has conditioned us to start hearing that riddle, that koan, in a way that our brain can start to think about it. So most people on the street really would have heard that and gone, too hard, I don't care. It's not even remotely interesting for me to consider this riddle. If we do find ourselves interested in it, the conclusion we might come to is that the answer is not a yes and no answer, a yes or no answer. We might say, if there's no one there to hear it, is there a forest? Let alone a tree that's falling. Because the principle is that in order for experience to be there, there needs to be awareness of it. If there's no awareness, there's no experience. So if we come to see life as an experience, what inevitably we will bump into is the awareness aspect. That's here, right? It's always here. Never not here. It's the thing that is registering the experience. I lost track. What was your comment that got me to start talking?
What is it that exists? That was what I asked.
Did you? Wow. Okay. What is it that exists? An experience. Life is always an experience. And we don't see it as experience. We see it as reality. Until, in the story, we come to see it as experience. And before we come to see it as experience, usually there are components of the story that tell us something, like life is a dream, or life is an experience. The story includes a question being asked, what is it that exists? And then an answer comes. We don't just see it as experience. We find ourselves reading, we find ourselves interested. And even when there are accounts of the person that had no interest in spirituality and they spontaneously had an awakening, it may not be as it seems. They may well have no conscious recognition of a seeking that happened beforehand, but the laws of the manifestation are very complex, not something that we'll ever understand, and it becomes very clear in this process that a lot of what is included as part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning comes from not only the experience that we remember, but experience we have no idea about. And so that person who has a spontaneous awakening may actually have a whole lot of past experience in their system that they have no knowledge of. And if that's the case, what appears to be a spontaneous awakening without any prior interest in spirituality may actually include lifetimes of spiritual inquiry and lifetimes of spiritual interest. All of which is condensed into insight or energy, data, that is included as part of a new birth's genes and up-to-date conditioning.
So does the brain create the awareness, or does the awareness or does the awareness...
Yeah, so the question is, does the brain create consciousness or awareness, or does consciousness create the brain? And as a teaching will tell you, will give you a concept that is useful. And so from one perspective, we'll say there is no brain, there is an experience, and everything that is in the experience is content arising within the experience, and the fundamental nature of experience is non-dual awareness. You can't ever have a dual experience. All experience at its core fundamentally is non-dual, meaning awareness of content, and the content and the awareness are not two. So the content of the awareness will create the impression that thoughts come from a brain. They will also create the impression that consciousness comes from the brain. They'll create that impression because if in a particular moment a neurologist carries out certain tests by putting monitors and sensors on the head and then gets someone to observe certain stimuli, the monitor will start suggesting that there's brain activity. And so when the person talks, and we say, oh, thinking comes from the brain. And similar tests will lead to medical conclusions that say consciousness is created inside the brain. From a
experience that the brain is inside consciousness, if that's your experience, could that still come from the brain?
Yes.
Could still be like an illusion that comes from the brain. You appear from
That's why we can never actually, everything that, all insights we're given, all realizations are actually content of experience. So whatever insight comes, no matter how profound it is, it's experience telling us that. It's the experience in the moment, the insight is part of the experience. And experience is relative, meaning experience can be whatever it's designed to be. The experience will be created in such a way that makes it seem like it is an insight about reality. But that's contained in the experience, that sense that this is, I now know reality is the experience. So you're exactly right. If we have an experience that says the brain arises in consciousness, that could be an experience of the consciousness coming from the brain.
Doesn't help. That's more confusing.
It is all unresolvable, but when you see that's unresolvable, that's it.
Yeah.
It's over. It's like,
So what you're saying is that it is ultimately unresolvable, but when we see that it's unresolvable, the unresolvable nature is not a problem. Actually, it's the seeing that it's unresolvable is the end of any problem. we have a problem and we suffer when we want answers to something unresolvable. Once we realize it's unresolvable and actually it's not important, and when we realize that wanting answers for unresolvable things is our suffering, then the collapse is a collapse that's not a disaster. So we end up getting what we want, what we actually always wanted, through a completely different mechanism than we expected. We expected that I'll get what I want when I figure it all out. And in fact, we get what we want when we realize I can't figure it out. So the doer says, I will get what I want when I make it happen. That's what the doer says. And when we're told you're not the doer, that sounds like terrible news. Oh, well, in that case, I have to just resign myself to the fact that life is unfair. But when we really see I'm not the doer, what happens is the suffering collapses, and we end up getting what we want, which is just happiness, the end of suffering, in a completely different way to what the doer thought. The doer thought my happiness is to be found in outcomes. In fact, happiness turns out to be continuous unbroken peace of mind, which is simply the end of suffering, and a large part of suffering is my happiness is to be found in outcomes. I'm the doer and the other is the doer. I am going to do the finding of the outcomes. So it's actually great news to see I'm not the doer.
Do you still get reincarnation and karma with not being the doer? Because I can't see how you would.
Yes. Karma, well, depends on your definition of karma. So the popularized definition of karma is I am the doer, I have done things wrong, and now I'm being punished. Or I am the doer, I have done very good things, and now I'm being rewarded for my good actions. So the underlying belief in karma is one of personal doership and personal reward and personal punishment. When we see that there is no doer, the notion of karma as a personal thing falls away. However, in practice, because life is a story of cause and effect, action and reaction, action and consequence, or deed and consequence, we then see that karma still unfolds, but it's not my karma, it's not personal karma. So if in a particular moment someone steals something, that's part of destiny. So God can never grab that person, pull them up to heaven and say, hey, you shouldn't do that. Because God, as the creator of the story, has included in the story that stealing is going to happen. It's included in the story a person that is perfectly designed in order for the stealing that is destined to happen. So God will never punish anyone for what they have done. God has become everyone. God has created the story, and so everyone in each moment is doing exactly what they're destined to do. However, the story of life being a story of action and reaction, or deed and consequence, means that the person that has been destined to kill someone, if it's destined for them to get caught and convicted, may be executed. And so that is karma. But we can now see it's karma, but only because karma means cause and effect. The story of life is all karma. So there's no such thing as personal karma. There's no such thing as karma of punishment of an individual or reward of an individual. There's reward within the story and punishment within the story.
There would be more than one life, there'd be reincarnation then, or not. Or it wouldn't be that individual reincarnation.
No, oh yeah. So yeah, just so I'll repeat, as you said, so then, well no, you've got the microphone, you repeat.
I was saying it couldn't be an individual that was reincarnated if there's no doer.
No doer. There is no individual, no soul that transmigrates from one life to another life to another life. However, the story is set in place that, let's say, Mary, who lived in the Middle Ages, experienced life a certain way according to her destiny, and took life to be personal, was persecuted by her village for something she did, which is really not her doing, but the story is for the villagers to persecute her and stone her to death. And the way she received that before, when she was being convicted, she felt great shame, let's say, in what she did. She might have felt hatred towards the villagers for inflicting this punishment on her. And she might have died with this unresolved load of guilt and blame. And in the story, when Mary dies, that's the end of Mary. The body is the vehicle through which Maryness exists. So when the vehicle, the body is burnt or buried, no more Mary vehicle in order for consciousness to function through. However, what appears to happen, what the story of life demonstrates, if we're going to run with the causal explanation, all right? So if we look at it all as a spontaneous creation, then just like in the dream, we realize there is no past. When a dream spontaneously arises, it just comes out and there's nothing that comes before. But there are the impression of something that comes before. There could be a memory in the dream. But we see that memory is not coming from something that actually happened. So if we look at life as a spontaneous creation, we'd say there's no such thing as past lives, there's only this moment right now. But in this moment, there is often an object in the experience, something that we call memory, a memory that implies that there were past lives, so what we would call a past life memory. So there would be an experience in the present moment of a vision, let's say, that's accompanied with a strong emotion, and the vision and the emotion are linked to an event that seems to be happening to someone that's not me. And in the experiencing of that past life event, particularly a particular type of emotion that is attached to that, it may reveal why we function a certain way in this moment. Oh, that's why I'm afraid of groups of people.
So what's coming, what's that if it's not a soul?
Yeah.
What is it?
If it is a good question. If it's not a soul, what is it? And the explanation put forward here is it's a packet of data, a packet of unresolved energy. So not a soul, because the imagery I'll put forward is that data is stored on a cosmic disk somewhere, the cosmic reincarnation cloud, as data. Right? Now you can't store a soul as data, but that's the image I'm putting, is that when the body dies, this bundle of energy that is unresolved fears, desires, talents and insights, that bundle of energy, data, up-to-date conditioning, without any consciousness, because the consciousness which linked to the body has now retracted back to source because the body is dead. And this data gets imprinted on a hard drive somewhere and is stored there. And then according to the story of life, a new incarnation comes into existence, a new birth, all exactly as destined. And it just so happens that in the story they say, oh, the story and Mary's unresolved data becomes part of John, this new birth that was destined to happen in this moment, becomes part of John's genes and up-to-date conditioning.
So it's not even mine, it's any old person's.
Yes, but any old person that you have a link to.
Sorry?
Any old person that, according to the story, you have a link to.
Right.
A link in that, well, any old person, but it's a particular any old person, the one whose unresolved stuff I happen to have.
Okay.
And they might have been, linked to a life before. So the unresolved in a life before comes into them. So in Mary, there might not just be the unresolved of that event, but the unresolved that also came from some life previous to Mary. So Mary there might have been 10 links before that, a whole chain.
Yeah.
And when we hear about chain, then automatically we say, oh, my past life, I live. Who's this I that live? I only know Roger. Roger is a result of impersonal consciousness of source that has no characteristics other than awareness and being. That impersonal consciousness of source links to the body, the vehicle, and becomes Rogeness. So Rogeness exists when the electricity, if we use another example, electricity plugging into many appliances, a heater, a fan, a fridge, and when the one electricity plugs into each of these appliances that are uniquely designed to output a particular output, heat from a heater, movement from a fan, cold air from a fridge, the output is exactly according to the appliance or vehicle, and what powers or what goes through is the one undifferentiated electricity, the same electricity into each one. And so the human being, Roger, is this undifferentiated consciousness functioning through a particular body. So this Roger dies when the body dies. So there is no Roger to have lived a past life. If the life before Roger, not before, but the one that I end up getting the packet of energy from, if that is John, the Johnness comes from the same impersonal consciousness that is functioning through all of us, having linked to a vehicle which is called John, has unique John characteristics, and then there's Johnness that emanates out of that individual experience. But when the body John's body dies, that's the end of John. The only thing that remains in this concept is the packet of energy of unresolved desires, fears, talents and insights that were in that body of John. It seems like that gets stored somewhere.
But there is a link of some
It
kind
appears so when there are experiences of past lives. The experience that comes is not usually just of one past life, but a series of past lives. Which makes sense that if the unresolved energy in the one before me, let's say John, was unresolved energy from 10 past lives, then when John dies and that packet of data is stored and then put into a new birth, then the new birth is actually carrying within it memory of 10 different events or lives. It doesn't mean that it has the memory of the full life. It just has the memory of the unresolved issues.
Okay.
And I'm curious.
Along that, what we are talking about, I'm curious. So, would you, could this body experience some unresolved energy of yours, for instance, or do we have to wait for that life to end and then the packet or whatever?
That body.
Yeah.
That consciousness, so your consciousness, can I say your name or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Pilar's experience can experience the memory of another life, not my life now, because we're not linked. You can only be linked to lives that have been lived and died. So according to this concept, this theory here, you will have memories from those lives that have been deposited into you. And so you will experience them when it's destined for them to be experienced. In order for that energy to be resolved, and all this talk about past lives and energy, let me make it clear, it's because the energy that gets transferred across is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. The doer energy that was accumulated in past lives in relation to events, significant events, that were interpreted based on the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. So unresolved fears, things that we were psychologically fearful of, unresolved desires, things that we wanted, that we thought would make us happy. Unresolved talents, which really means talents that we had that maybe we were prideful about. And insights. Insights, meaning insights that an individual has had as a result of spiritual inquiry that happened in their life. And so from my experience in refining this concept, that's what I say is brought forward. Because in my life, I was born into life without a whole lot of suffering. When I found myself reading the certain spiritual texts, it all made sense very quickly. Why did it make sense? I don't have a reason or an explanation for why I didn't have much suffering, and why reading information that really is quite foreign, why did it make sense, and why did a whole lot of things fall into place very quickly. So my assumption is that some other life, and it's not only an assumption, but with the aid of an experience, conclusion is that there was a life of which the packet of energy was deposited into me, a life that was very much of spiritual inquiry. A life of a monk that died at a very old age in a place of quite a lot of peace. And his realization at the time of nearly dying was, wow, I've had all of these realizations. Essentially, I'm living as consciousness. And the realization was, if I was 40 years old or 30 years old, not 92 and about to die, and I had the same knowledge that I have now, I would hang my monk robe up, say thanks very much to the monastery, and leave and go out into life and live as a householder or as an ordinary person. So that was the insight that this monk had very close to his death. He said, no point in me doing that now, I'm about to die. And so, that's my explanation. I didn't do anything special, far from it. What happened was quite unexplained, given the, the spiritual inquiry beforehand. And so my conclusion is that a lot of the unresolved desires and fears and talents were worked out in that other life, not my life. Not Roger didn't live a past life, this other life. And what came along in the packet was a whole lot of insights. So I got a good packet, really.
And how do you know that? Did you do past life therapy or something like that?
No, not as a therapy, but along the way, the journey, so to speak, included a lot of energies coming out, what was left of the doership energy, and that energy came out in the form of memories, not from this life. I didn't have very many events in this life that had guilt or blame in them or doership in them, but memories that came out of not my lives. So I don't want anyone listening to actually take what I'm saying too seriously, because does this mean that past lives actually exist? From the perspective that all there is this, which is we can hold both. This is an experience, that everything I'm saying and everything I experienced is not a reflection of truth, not a reflection that says, this absolutely happened. There was a monk that, I don't know, I just have a memory that is actually just an experience in the present moment. it presents itself as if it is a memory that comes from a past life, a life that has been lived previously. And so, because it presents itself that way, I like to hold both, that it's a momentary experience, and the content of the momentary experience is a content that implies a past and a future. And so, if I'm asked, I'll be able to tell the story from that perspective, that says, well, as life has presented itself to me, and presented itself in a way where simultaneously the understanding that life presented is accompanied by no suffering, I would say, well, that's good enough for me to know that that's an accurate enough concept that I can put forward. A concept that is not going to contain in it doership and attachment to outcome. If it did, if I was holding a concept that inherently contained doership and attachment to outcome in it, then my experience would be accompanied by suffering. And if my experience was accompanied by suffering, I'd have to say, I haven't quite got a framework that is accurate enough. My framework is not an accurate enough description of life. But to the extent that I have a framework and suffering isn't arising, I can then say the framework is accurate enough to not harbour beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome in it. What I keep forgetting the question today. What exactly was your question? Just so I know that whether...
I think you answered it
okay.
a while ago.
Okay.
Are we going to have a break?
Actually, we're due to finish in 10 minutes or so.
Okay. I have a question. I have heard a story about the Buddha, and someone asked a question, and I'm not sure if this is quite correct. Something like this: who are you? Or are you a holy person? And the reply was, this is what someone told me, it was, the Buddha said, I'm not a holy person, I am awake. So what does that mean?
In my interpretation is that...
Have you heard that story? I mean,
no, but it's a nice story. So what he's really getting across in that is two things. One, he's saying, I'm no different to anyone else. There is no such thing as a holy person. Everyone in essence is the same. Everyone in essence is the impersonal consciousness of Source, which is the same, linked to a particular body-mind organism. So in Buddha's case, he was saying, I am the body-mind organism. And the personal consciousness is the consciousness of Source functioning through this vehicle, which is happening for everyone, all the time. And his point of saying, I'm not holy, we're all the same, the difference is I'm awake. I am aware that what I am is the one impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a body and functioning through a body. I'm aware that it's the same for everyone else. And therefore, I no longer see myself as a separate independent entity, no longer see myself as the doer, and therefore no longer see the other in the same way.
awake. Thank you.
Thank you. So, is it on? Is it on?
No. You have to press it like
Yeah.
around.
Hello. How should I put this? Awareness. If you know yourself as awareness, or have had that experience of knowing yourself as awareness or beingness, that doesn't mean that the sense of personal doership automatically falls away.
No, it doesn't. Very true. Which is why a lot of people have awakenings, which I wouldn't really necessarily call awakenings if what happens is an experience that they know is very radically different to what they normally experience, and yet if no significant conclusions happen as a result of that, like nothing particular in the experience stands out. No, sort of no. So an awakening experience is essentially a behind-the-scenes look at the nature of life as experience. And if that happens, but then you ask someone, so what was the significance of that? And they sort of, what do you mean? So they know something significant has happened, but there's no conclusion, no clicks as a result. Then it hasn't left much behind. And so there's plenty of people that talk about having an awakening experience, but in practice, it's like, who cares? Because in practice, they'll say not much has changed. Whereas on the other hand, you have awakening experiences where afterwards there's a significant difference, because the awakening experience then becomes essentially information that previously was unavailable, information about life. We've seen life radically different. It's like, oh my God, what I am is consciousness. What I've always been is consciousness. And what I will always be is consciousness. And this consciousness that I am is not touched by anything that is happening in the flow of life. So if that awakening happens and it becomes all of what I just said becomes clear, or part of what I said becomes clear, then the movement after that, the continuation of the spiritual process, will include that realization. And in that awakening, it could be clear that whatever is happening in the experience, it could be clear that it's all just happening. That what I thought I was as the body is actually just an object moving. That I have never been the body, I am the subject, but the subject is not the body. And so from that witnessing perspective, which in an awakening experience is usually very profound and present, from that perspective it might also be clear, well, no one is doing anything. Life is an experience, life is just happening. And so afterwards, that recognition can be carried into your inquiry. An inquiry that then sort of sees old energies of doership and says, no, that's my old way of seeing it. That's not how it is anymore. So that would be the difference for me is, we could call them both an awakening experience, but to me the awakening experience that really counts is one that leaves behind some significant insight or conclusion about what was shown.
Is awakening the same as enlightenment?
No. So the comment there is awakening the same as enlightenment? Not at all. Awakening is spontaneous, and it's definitely not the end of the road. In fact, you could, from some regards, say it's the beginning of the road. It's not really the beginning, because there could be a lot of inquiry that comes before awakening also. But awakening tends to reveal the nature of life in one way or another, and how significantly that revelation remains in place as part of destiny, whether it's just fleeting and then fades away, or whether it leaves something definite in place. And after that, there is the process of deliverance. And the process of deliverance is where the deeply ingrained beliefs to the contrary of what was shown, get uprooted. And that can take a long, long time.
And you can suffer through that, can't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. So after awakening, there is this process of flip-flopping, going from peace, where it's like, it's happened. It's happened. So life is still pleasure and pain, and when it's painful, it's like it's taken in one stride, it's not taken personally, and it's the typical, I'm not involved in life. The person, this is where what I used to think I was as the doer that would get attached to everything and insist on things being, that's fallen away. And so sometimes that's described as there's no more person, the person has dissolved. But I mean, I think it's much more accurate to say the doer aspect has dissolved. Not claiming ownership, not feeling attacked by what the other does and what happens in the flow of life. And then we wake up one morning and it's like, oh no, everything's changed. You know, we open the fridge and there's no milk, and it's a big, big deal that there's no milk. Whereas yesterday, you know, something much more significant could have happened on the level of the flow of life, pain, and it was taken in our stride. And so we find ourselves going through this flip-flopping stage, and there's a lot of insights that starts coming from that flip-flopping stage. And that's the time when the remaining ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are being dissolved. So when we hear that, you know, someone has this radical shift, right, I suspect that life doesn't necessarily, even for people that have a shift and then liberation happens sometime down the track. So liberation, to me, compared to awakening, is when suffering ends. So it's liberation from suffering. Awakening is awakening to one's true nature. But while the awakening happens, or after it happens, that certain beliefs are very much still in the body. They need to be uprooted. Just one second.
You know that guy, Bob Harris, who makes the tapes. And it's Genpo Roshi, anyways, in the Enlightened Guy. He said you go through a dark soul where it all collapses around you, and you question have you been through that?
I didn't have an experience that included this dark night of the soul. Yeah, to me, the dark night of the soul is more likely to happen if someone has a strong sense of doership and me, and if an awakening happens while that sense of doership is still quite strong, then the revelations that have happened will bring about realizations that are quite threatening, scary to the remaining identity. So what is experienced will be a lot of existential fear and a lot of the ingrained beliefs in doership, this energy coming up in a way that can be quite overwhelming, where we feel like, you know, this is the dark night of the soul, meaning the, you know, all the stuff coming up. So I can see how it fits in, and a lot of people talk about it. I didn't have an experience that fit that description.
Thank you.
So we didn't get around to talking about doing what we feel like. So that will be for tomorrow, for those that are coming, which is a discussion on how we can come to see that we tend to live life based on all of our shoulds and shouldn'ts. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are essentially a strategy that has been put in place based on the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 ultimately love. And so it's a whole strategy that has been put in place that says this is the best way to act in life in order to get as much love as possible. And so with that underlying premise of how to live life, we tend to ignore a movement that is much more intelligent, and that movement is available at any point, or that instruction, tapping into that instruction, is available at any point. It just requires the shoulds and shouldn'ts to be seen as not very wise. A set of instructions that society has put in place, because society is looking for pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so once we clearly see that this way of functioning from my shoulds and shouldn'ts doesn't deliver flow and peace, what it delivers is an accumulation of uncomfortableness, until such time we say, I can't do this anymore. I need to make changes to this area, and this area of my life. And those changes are usually changes in regards to situations that were put in place from this strong belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And so we start finding the courage at first to do small things from a different place, a place of feeling, without being so concerned about the outcome, because we've realized that actually the outcome is pleasure, and pleasure is not as much of an attack. Pleasure or pain is not as much an attack on who I truly am. So slowly we start living and functioning from a different place, and start to feel a freedom, a relaxation, and a connection to who we really are. And unless that starts happening, it means if the shift doesn't happen, we might understand all of this intellectually and not realize the amount of shoulds and shouldn'ts that are contrary to the conceptual understanding. And then we wonder why it doesn't go deeper and deeper. And the answer is it doesn't go deeper and deeper because on another hand, we're completely supporting the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 without realizing it, by just doing what we think we should do in each moment instead of tapping in and doing what we feel to do. And the other thing that I'd like to go through tomorrow is an exploration into the nature of consciousness, a guided meditation that will explore the experience from a perspective that allows us to start questioning various objects, like thought objects, that tend to remain even when we're doing meditation, and tend to create still a residual self-image of the human that sort of superimposes itself on the meditation space. And for as long as that happens and we don't realize that an object that is not really in that space is asserting itself as a thought, let's say a thought that I am sitting in meditation, if we don't realize that there's a thought that is still saying that there is someone sitting in a room meditating, then the meditation is contaminated in a sense with this residual self-image of who I am and what life is. So we'll do a guided exploration into the nature of experience and see what reveals itself. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.